On a quiet afternoon in February 2005, a detective in Wichita, Kansas opened a floppy disk that had just arrived in the mail. It came from a man who for 31 years had outrun every investigator who ever looked for him. He called himself BTK. Bind, torture, kill. He had taunted police with letters for decades, certain he was smarter than the people chasing him. He was wrong. And the reason he was wrong has almost nothing to do with luck, and everything to do with a method built for exactly this purpose, to get inside the mind of people like him before they are ever caught. That method is called criminal profiling. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how it works. How investigators read a crime scene like a language, how they detect a lie before a suspect finishes their first sentence, and how a few extra seconds of eye contact, held just a little too long, can be the very thing that gives a killer away. Before we go further, one thing needs to be said clearly. This is not a magic trick, and it is not guesswork. It is a discipline, built over 50 years from prison interviews, case data, and a kind of psychology that is, frankly, uncomfortable to sit with. But once you understand it, you will not be able to unsee it. Not just in criminals, in co-workers, in family, in yourself. And one more thing before we begin. Almost everything popular television has taught you about reading people is, to put it bluntly, wrong. Crossed arms do not mean someone is lying. Avoiding eye contact does not mean someone is guilty. By the time this video ends, you will know exactly why those myths persist, what the real signals actually look like, and why even the experts who built this science still get it wrong far more often than the movies would have you believe. In 1972, the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, opened a unit that, on paper, made no sense. It had no real budget, no support from headquarters, and a mission that most experienced agents considered close to fiction: to study the minds of the most violent offenders in the country, well enough to predict what they would do next. This was the Behavioral Science Unit, and the man most responsible for turning it from a fringe idea into one of the most important tools in modern law enforcement was a young agent named John Douglas, working alongside his colleague, Robert Ressler. Douglas did something almost nobody in federal law enforcement had done before. He did not stay behind a desk. He walked into maximum security prisons, sat across from men convicted of some of the most violent crimes in American history, and asked them, in plain language, to explain themselves. Not their crimes in lurid detail, their thinking, what they noticed about their victims, what made them feel powerful, what made them feel like they had control, what mistakes, looking back, worried them the most. One of the most important of these interview subjects was a man named Edmund Kemper, a 6'9" former killer with an unusually high IQ, who turned out to be, in Douglas's own later writing, one of the most articulate and self-aware sources the unit ever interviewed. Kemper did not minimize what he had done. He explained it, methodically, almost academically, describing the buildup of tension before an offense, the brief sense of release afterward, and the empty, anticlimactic feeling that followed within hours. That single detail, the emptiness after the act, rather than lasting satisfaction, turned out to apply across dozens of unrelated cases, and it became one of the earliest building blocks of offender typology. Across these interviews, a pattern began to surface that would change criminal investigation permanently. Crime was not random. Even the most chaotic, frenzied scenes carried information if you knew what to look for. A signature, almost as individual as a fingerprint, written into the choices an offender made before, during, and after the act. This idea, that behavior reflects personality, and personality can be reverse-engineered from behavior, is the foundation of everything we are about to walk through. It sounds simple when you say it like that. In practice, it took the Bureau over a decade, hundreds of interviews, and a handful of cases that nearly destroyed the unit's credibility before anyone outside Quantico took it seriously. It was also Robert Ressler, working alongside Douglas, who popularized the very term most people now take for granted: serial killer. Before the late 1970s, law enforcement in the United States had no standard language for an offender who killed multiple separate victims over an extended period with a psychological cooling-off interval in between. Without shared language, jurisdictions had no easy way to even describe what they were looking at, let alone compare notes with a department 3 states away that might be hunting the same person under a completely different case number. One of those early test cases involved a string of attacks where investigators had almost nothing to work with. No witnesses, no forensic evidence that pointed anywhere useful, just a scene and the decisions someone had made inside it. Douglas and his colleagues built a profile from behavior alone, an estimate of age, of background, of the kind of life this person was most likely living. When a suspect was finally identified through other means, the profile lined up close enough that local detectives, who had been openly skeptical, started calling Quantico before they did almost anything else. That is the moment profiling stopped being an experiment and started becoming a method. And the method, broken down to its core, rests on 3 pillars that we are going to walk through one at a time. How the crime scene itself is read, how the victim is studied as carefully as the offender, and how an offender behaves once they are sitting across from an investigator, no longer in control of the story. The first pillar is crime scene analysis, and it starts with a single question that sounds almost too simple to matter. Was this organized or disorganized? An organized crime scene shows planning. The offender brought their own weapon instead of grabbing whatever was on hand. There is an attempt, however clumsy, to control the environment, to limit evidence, to leave with some sense of completion. A disorganized scene looks like the opposite: improvised, chaotic, often triggered by impulse rather than design, evidence scattered carelessly because the offender was not thinking several steps ahead. This single distinction does enormous work. An organized offender tends to be older, more socially capable, sometimes holding down a stable job, even a relationship, living what looks from the outside like an ordinary life. A disorganized offender tends to be younger, more isolated, often with a documented history of psychological distress or substance use, someone whose interior chaos finally broke into the world around them. Neither category is a guarantee. Profiling has never claimed to be fortune-telling, and the agents who built this method were the first to say so publicly, often to the frustration of journalists who wanted something closer to certainty. What profiling offers, instead, is probability, a narrowing of the field. A way to tell local police, out of every person who could theoretically have done this, here is the much smaller group worth looking at first. Beyond the organized-disorganized split, profilers look closely at what is technically called staging. This is when an offender deliberately rearranges a scene to mislead investigators, to suggest a different motive, a different kind of offender, sometimes even a different crime entirely. Staging is, in its own strange way, one of the most revealing behaviors an offender can engage in, because it requires them to imagine how an investigator will read the scene, and then try to outthink that reading. Few people are as good at this as they believe themselves to be. There is also a critical distinction analysts draw between modus operandi and signature. Modus operandi, or MO, is simply what an offender does to successfully carry out the act. The tools, the approach, the timing. MO can change over time as an offender learns, adapts, or gets more confident. Signature is different. It is the behavior that goes beyond what is strictly necessary, the part of the act that serves an emotional or psychological need rather than a practical one. An offender might change their MO repeatedly across a series of crimes, but the signature, the emotional fingerprint underneath it, tends to stay remarkably consistent. This is often what allows investigators to link crimes that, on the surface, look quite different from one another. Victim positioning, the choice of location, even what was taken from the scene, and what was deliberately left behind, all get weighed, not in isolation, but against the larger pattern building across the investigation. A profiler is rarely looking at one piece of evidence and drawing a conclusion. They are layering dozens of small observations until a coherent picture of a person starts to emerge from the noise. The second pillar is victimology, and it is, in the words of more than one profiler who built this field, the most underrated tool in the entire process. The question is deceptively simple. Why this victim? Why this person, in this place, at this specific time? The answer reveals something the crime scene alone often cannot. If an offender selected a victim they already knew, that points toward a personal motive, a grievance, an existing relationship that soured. If the victim was a stranger, selected at random or by opportunity, that points toward something very different, a predatory pattern, often repeatable, often escalating. Investigators also assess what is called victim risk level. A low-risk victim is someone whose daily life is stable, supervised, and predictable. Someone who would be difficult to access without planning. A high-risk victim is someone whose circumstances make them more vulnerable to opportunistic targeting. When an offender repeatedly selects high-risk victims, it often suggests an offender operating with less sophistication or planning. When an offender successfully targets low-risk victims, it suggests someone patient, observant, and willing to invest real time before acting, which narrows the type of person police should be looking for considerably. Investigators build what amounts to a complete portrait of the victim's life in the days and weeks before the crime. Routines, relationships, anywhere they were vulnerable, predictable, visible. Not to assign blame, which is a misunderstanding that profiling has had to publicly correct more than once, but because an offender's choice of victim is itself a behavior, and every behavior is information. This is also where investigators start to estimate how an offender selects targets going forward, which becomes critical the moment a case is no longer about solving a single crime, but about predicting and preventing the next one. A profiler studying victimology is, in effect, asking, if this person does this again, who is most at risk and where? Before we get to the case that proved this entire method, there is one more analytical layer worth understanding, because it applies just as much to written words as it does to crime scenes. Statement analysis. Investigators trained in this technique study language itself for signs of deception, not by listening for nervousness, but by examining structure. A truthful account, recalled from genuine memory, tends to be told largely in chronological order, includes specific sensory detail, and uses consistent pronoun ownership. A fabricated account often shifts tense unexpectedly, drops pronouns at emotionally significant moments, replacing I with more distancing language, and tends to skip quickly over the actual moment in question, while over-explaining the parts before and after it. This technique becomes especially powerful when an offender voluntarily puts their own words on paper, which brings us directly to the case this entire video has been building toward. To understand how powerful this method became, it helps to look at the case that, more than almost any other, shaped how the public understands criminal profiling. The BTK killer. Starting in January 1974, with the murder of 4 members of the Otero family in Wichita, Kansas, a series of killings emerged that investigators eventually linked through a chillingly consistent signature. An offender who bound his victims, who wrote to police and local media describing details only the killer could know, who seemed to want recognition almost as much as he wanted control. In a letter left for police, He gave himself the name BTK. Bind, torture, kill. Investigators, working with behavioral analysts trained in the methods Douglas and his colleagues had developed, built a profile years before any suspect was identified. The offender, they believed, was someone who appeared completely unremarkable to the people around him. Likely someone in a position of minor authority. Someone organized enough to evade capture for years, methodical enough to plan each attack, and, critically, someone who needed an audience. The letters were not a mistake. Statement analysis of his writing showed a controlled, almost bureaucratic tone, language more consistent with someone used to filling out forms and writing reports than with the chaotic ramblings investigators sometimes expected from an anonymous killer. For years, the killings continued in clusters, separated by long stretches of apparent silence, then went quiet altogether for over a decade and a half. Then, in 2004, the offender resurfaced. After years without contact, he began sending communications again, apparently unable to resist the pull of attention he had once thrived on. It was, in many ways, exactly what profilers would have predicted. An offender whose psychological need to be seen would eventually outweigh his own self-preservation. In 2005, that need proved fatal to his freedom. He sent police a floppy disk, asking, almost unbelievably, whether it could be traced. Investigators recovered deleted metadata pointing to a specific church and a man named Dennis Rader, a married father, a Cub Scout leader, and the president of his church congregation council. He was also, at the time of his arrest, working as a local compliance officer, a job that, chillingly, gave him a degree of authority and access inside his own community. Rader fit the profile almost exactly. Organized, outwardly ordinary, embedded in a position of small but real authority, and driven, ultimately, by the same need for recognition that had defined his communications from the very beginning. The method had not just helped catch him, it had described him in broad strokes, years before anyone knew his name. Now, here is the detail that matters just as much as the success stories, and it is the detail we promised earlier. Profiling is not infallible, and the cases where it stumbled taught investigators almost as much as the cases where it succeeded. In the investigation into the Green River Killer in Washington State, one of the longest-running serial murder cases in American history, a man named Gary Ridgway was actually questioned by detectives relatively early in the investigation in 1984. He was administered a polygraph test. He passed. He was set aside as a person of interest, while the investigation pursued other leads for nearly 2 more decades, even as the body count quietly continued to grow. Ridgway was eventually identified through DNA evidence in 2001, and in a later plea agreement confirmed responsible for dozens of murders, making him one of the most prolific convicted serial killers in American history. The case is a sobering reminder that profiling narrows a field of suspects. It does not replace forensic evidence, and it is not designed to. The investigators who built this discipline have always been explicit on this point, even when popular television dramatizations blur the line. This is the part of the method that rarely makes it into the dramatic version of the story. Profiling works best as one tool among many, layered with forensic science, victimology, and old-fashioned investigative legwork. An offender who slips through a polygraph, who maintains a convincingly ordinary life, who does not match the expected profile closely enough to draw suspicion, can stay hidden for years. The method narrows the field. It does not guarantee the field is correctly narrowed every time, and the agents who built it have spent decades trying to correct the myth that it does. One of the quietest but most important breakthroughs in this entire field had nothing to do with psychology at all. It had to do with paperwork and the lack of it. For most of the 20th century, American law enforcement operated almost entirely in isolation. Department by department, county by county. A serial offender could commit crimes across 3 or 4 different jurisdictions and never appear as a pattern to anyone, because no single agency had visibility into what the others were investigating. A detective in one city had no practical way of knowing that a strikingly similar case had occurred 200 miles away the previous year. It took a persistent Los Angeles police detective named Pierce Brooks, who had been pushing the idea since the 1950s, to finally convince the federal government that this was solvable. In 1985, his proposal became reality with the launch of VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, a centralized national database where agencies anywhere in the country could log the specific behavioral details of unsolved violent crimes and automatically be flagged if a strikingly similar case appeared somewhere else. This is where the behavioral science unit's research and basic record-keeping finally intersected. In 1992, Douglas, along with colleagues Ann Burgess, Alan Burgess, and Robert Ressler, published the Crime Classification Manual, a standardized system for categorizing homicide and other violent crime by motive and behavior rather than simply by statute. Criminal enterprise homicide, personal cause homicide, sexual homicide, group cause homicide. Each category broken down further into specific behavioral subtypes. It might sound like dry bureaucratic language, but this shared vocabulary is precisely what allowed a detective in one state to describe a case to a detective in another state and instantly understand they might be looking at the same offender, even with zero forensic evidence in common. Profiling did not just need psychology to work, it needed a shared language and a shared filing system to actually travel beyond the walls of a single police department. This brings us to the third pillar, and it is the one most people find the most fascinating, because it is the one you can actually practice noticing in your own life: behavior under direct questioning. When a suspect sits down across from an investigator, the conversation itself becomes evidence, not just what is said, but how it is said, and crucially, whether the verbal account matches the nonverbal behavior surrounding it. Investigators trained in behavioral interviewing are taught to look for incongruence, moments where words and body language tell 2 different stories at the same time. A suspect who says with apparent conviction, "I would never hurt her," while their shoulders pull inward, their hands disappear beneath the table, and their speech rate suddenly slows down, has not proven anything. Incongruence is not a confession, but it is a flag, and flags are where real investigative attention gets focused. This is also where a structured interrogation method developed outside the FBI, but widely adopted across American law enforcement, becomes relevant. The Reid technique. Developed in the 1940s and 50s and refined since, it breaks an interview into a behavioral analysis phase, where investigators ask carefully neutral questions and observe baseline behavior, followed, only if suspicion is warranted, by a structured 9-step accusatory phase designed to move a suspect from denial toward a true account of events. We are dedicating an entire future video to those 9 steps in detail. So for now, the principle to take away is simpler. Nothing in that room means anything until you know what normal looks like first. That baseline first principle is why trained interviewers spend the opening minutes of almost any serious interview asking questions that seem almost irrelevant. Your commute, your weekend, your job. They are not making small talk. They are calibrating an instrument, and that instrument is the person sitting across from them. Once a baseline is established, deviations become meaningful. A change in posture, a shift in speech rate, a sudden increase in what behavioral analysts call adapters, self-touching, fidgeting, small physical actions that the body produces almost involuntarily to manage internal stress. None of these signs alone prove deception, but clustered together at a specific moment in a conversation tied to a specific question, they become very difficult to ignore. This is also a good place to correct one of the most widely repeated myths in popular culture: the idea that the polygraph is a lie detector in any literal sense. A polygraph does not detect lies. It measures physiological arousal, heart rate, skin conductivity, breathing pattern. It cannot distinguish between the arousal caused by deception and the arousal caused by simple fear of not being believed, which is exactly why a confident, practiced liar can sometimes pass one, and an innocent but anxious person can sometimes fail. This is precisely why behavioral analysis, watching the full pattern of language and body language together over time, remains the more reliable tool in a skilled investigator's hands, even decades after the polygraph entered common use. No discussion of criminal behavior is complete without addressing the personality trait most closely and most inaccurately associated with it in popular culture: psychopathy. The clinical foundation for this concept goes back to 1941, when psychiatrist Hervey Cleckley published The Mask of Sanity, describing a pattern he had observed repeatedly in certain patients: superficial charm, genuine intelligence, and an almost complete absence of the emotional responses, guilt, empathy, lasting anxiety, that govern most human behavior. On the surface, these individuals could seem entirely ordinary, even unusually charismatic. Underneath, Cleckley argued, there was a kind of emotional hollowness that conventional psychiatry of the time struggled to even name properly. Decades later, Canadian psychologist Robert Hare built on this foundation to create the psychopathy checklist, now used widely in forensic and clinical settings to assess these traits in a structured, scoreable way. The checklist is generally understood in two clusters. The first covers interpersonal and affective traits: glibness, grandiosity, pathological lying, shallow emotion, and a profound lack of remorse. The second covers a more visibly antisocial lifestyle: impulsivity, irresponsibility, poor behavioral controls, and a long history of rule-breaking that began early in life. It is critical to be precise here, because this is one of the most misunderstood ideas in true crime media. Psychopathy and criminality are not the same thing, and they do not automatically predict each other. A meaningful percentage of people who score high on psychopathic traits never commit a violent crime in their entire lives. Many channel those same traits into high-pressure, high-stakes careers where charm, risk tolerance, and emotional detachment are, for better or worse, professionally rewarded. And the overwhelming majority of violent offenders are not, clinically, psychopaths at all. The overlap exists, and it matters in certain cases, but it is a correlation, not a diagnosis disguised as a verdict. Where this connects directly back to behavioral analysis is in the interview room. A high-scoring psychopathic individual can often perform calm, confident, even warm and likable, far more convincingly than an average person under the same pressure. This is precisely why investigators are trained not to rely on overall impression or charisma at all. The leak, when it happens, tends to be narrower and more specific. A flicker of contempt instead of distress when discussing a victim, a level of detail and detachment that does not match the emotional weight of the event being described. The mask, as Cleckley named it 80 years ago, is usually very good. It is rarely perfect. There is one layer of this that goes even deeper than posture and word choice, and it happens almost entirely below conscious awareness: the human face. In the 1960s, a psychologist named Paul Ekman set out to answer a question that, at the time, divided the entire field of psychology. Are facial expressions universal, hardwired into every human being regardless of culture? Or are they learned, varying as much as language does from one society to another. Ekman traveled to remote, visually isolated communities, including groups in Papua New Guinea, who had almost no exposure to Western media or faces. He showed them photographs of expressions and asked them to identify the emotion. Over and over, across cultures with no shared visual language, the answers matched. Fear looked like fear. Disgust looked like disgust. Anger, surprise, sadness, contempt, joy. The human face, it turned out, speaks a single universal language across all 7 of these core emotions, no matter where on Earth you were born. From this research, Ekman and his colleagues eventually built the facial action coding system, a comprehensive map of every individual muscle movement the human face is capable of producing, and which combinations of those movements correspond to which genuine emotional states. It became, in effect, an anatomical dictionary of human feeling, and it is still the foundation of how facial behavior is studied today, in psychology, in animation, and in law enforcement training alike. From this same body of research came one of Ekman's most consequential discoveries for our purposes: the micro-expression. A genuine emotional reaction flashes across the human face involuntarily, often in less than half a second, before a person has time to consciously suppress or mask it. Even a practiced liar, someone who has rehearsed their story for hours, cannot fully prevent that initial flash. The conscious mind controls what we say. It does not fully control the first quarter second of what the face does. One especially useful concept that came out of this research is what is sometimes called the Duchenne smile, named after a 19th century French neurologist who first studied it. A genuine smile of real enjoyment involves not just the mouth, but the muscles around the eyes, producing the small creases people sometimes call crow's feet. A performed smile, produced consciously to seem friendly or reassuring, almost always engages the mouth alone, leaving the eyes flat. It is a small detail, but once you know to look for it, it is remarkably hard to miss, and remarkably hard to fake convincingly even when you are trying. This research did not stay confined to academic psychology. Law enforcement agencies, including units working closely with the same behavioral science tradition that produced criminal profiling, began training investigators to recognize these flashes. Not as standalone proof, no serious investigator would ever claim that, but as one more data point layered on top of everything else. The crime scene, the victimology, the verbal account, and now, the face itself, betraying what the mouth is trying to hide. In the interest of intellectual honesty, which this channel takes seriously, it would be a disservice to end this discussion without acknowledging that not every claim made about reading deception has held up perfectly under later scientific scrutiny. Researchers studying deception detection more broadly, most notably psychologists Charles Bond and Bella DePaulo, in a widely cited analysis spanning decades of experiments, found that the average person, including many professionals whose job involves spotting liars, performs only slightly better than random chance at identifying deception from demeanor alone, typically somewhere in the range of 54 to 57% accuracy, against a 50% baseline you would get from simply guessing. This does not mean the underlying science of facial expression or behavioral analysis is invalid. It means something more precise and frankly more useful. No single cue, no matter how well documented in a laboratory setting, should ever be treated as a standalone lie detector in the real world. This is exactly why the FBI's method was never built around any single tell. It was built around triangulation, layering crime scene behavior, victimology, statement structure, and nonverbal cues together, so that no individual signal has to carry the full weight of a conclusion on its own. The most experienced profilers and interviewers in this field have always described their work less as mind reading and more as disciplined pattern recognition under uncertainty, openly acknowledging the rate of error and treating every profile as a working hypothesis to be tested against new evidence, not a verdict handed down in advance. Here is where the method produces its strangest, most counterintuitive lesson. And it is the one detail that, once you understand it, changes how you watch every interview, every interrogation scene, every tense conversation for the rest of your life. Most people assume a guilty person looks nervous, sweating, avoiding eye contact, stammering. And sometimes that is exactly what happens. But experienced behavioral analysts will tell you that the more dangerous tell often looks like the opposite. Someone trying visibly hard to appear calm. Overly steady eye contact, held a beat too long, as though the person read somewhere that liars look away, and overcorrected. Answers that are too smooth, too complete, too neatly sequenced for a question nobody actually asked in that much detail. Genuine innocence tends to be a little messy. People who have nothing to hide often pause, backtrack, get details slightly out of order, because they are reconstructing a memory in real time rather than reciting a story they have rehearsed. This is the paradox at the center of the entire discipline. The suspect working hardest to look innocent is very often the one revealing the most. Not because trying to look calm is itself proof of guilt. It is not. But because that specific kind of effort, that specific kind of polish, is rare in people who are simply telling the truth without anything at stake. It is also worth directly debunking a few of the most persistent myths this paradox tends to expose. Crossed arms are not a reliable sign of dishonesty. They are at least as often a sign of someone simply being cold, or comfortable, or naturally reserved. Touching the nose, a gesture popularized almost entirely by a single, badly oversimplified study decades ago, has never held up under rigorous testing as a meaningful deception cue on its own. And looking away during a question is, more often than not, simply how most people retrieve a genuine memory. Eye contact actually tends to break naturally during real recall, which makes the unbroken stare a far more interesting signal than the broken one. You are very likely never going to sit across from a murder suspect in an interrogation room. But every single principle covered in this video applies, in a smaller and lower stakes way, to ordinary life. Establishing a baseline works in any relationship. You cannot tell when a friend, a partner, or a coworker is behaving unusually if you have never paid attention to how they behave normally. Watching for incongruence between words and body language applies in every negotiation, every difficult conversation, every moment someone tells you something that does not quite sit right, even if you cannot immediately say why. And the paradox of the overly polished answer applies everywhere humans have something to lose. The job candidate whose answers sound suspiciously rehearsed. The apology that arrives a little too quickly, a little too completely, with no hesitation at all. None of this makes someone guilty. It makes them worth a second, closer look, which is exactly the discipline this entire method is built on. Not jumping to conclusions, but learning to notice what is actually in front of you instead of what you expect to see. Try this the next time you are in any conversation that matters. Spend the first minute simply observing, without judging anything yet. Note posture, pace of speech, where the eyes naturally rest. That is your baseline. Only after that minute has passed should you start weighing whether anything shifts when the conversation turns to something with real stakes attached. This single habit, patience before judgment, is closer to the actual core of criminal profiling than any single gesture or tell could ever be. That is the real skill underneath everything the FBI's behavioral science unit built over the last 50 years. Not mind reading. Attention. The willingness to slow down, establish what normal looks like, and notice precisely where it breaks, without ever forgetting, as even the field's own founders insisted, that every read is a hypothesis, not a verdict. The behavioral science unit that Douglas and Ressler built in the 1970s does not exist anymore under that name. In the early 1990s, it was reorganized and renamed the Behavioral Analysis Unit, now operating as part of the FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, with specialized teams covering everything from crimes against adults to crimes against children to threat assessment for potential acts of targeted violence before they happen. One of the most significant additions to the original method since those early decades is geographic profiling, pioneered largely by criminologist and former police officer Kim Rossmo in the 1990s. The underlying insight is almost elegant in its simplicity. Offenders, like most people, tend to operate within a comfortable radius of the places they already know, but rarely strike too close to where they actually live. A balance researchers call the least effort principle paired with a buffer zone around the offender's home base. By mapping the locations of a connected series of crimes and running that pattern through statistical models, investigators can generate a probability surface, often visualized as a heat map, indicating the geographic area most likely to contain the offender's anchor point. This technique has since helped narrow searches in cases where behavioral profiling alone produced too broad a pool of suspects to act on. Modern profiling has also absorbed tools the original Quantico interviewers never had access to: cell phone location data, digital communication metadata, the same kind of trace evidence that ultimately ended the BTK case, and increasingly, statistical and computational models trained on decades of accumulated case data, rather than relying purely on individual investigator experience. The interview-based foundation Douglas built is still there, underneath all of it, but it now sits inside a much larger toolkit, one that treats behavioral analysis as a single, powerful layer in a far more data-rich investigative process. This video covered the foundation: crime scene analysis, victimology, statement analysis, the architecture that finally let separate departments compare notes, the psychology of the mask some offenders wear, behavior under questioning, and how the discipline has evolved since. But there is an entire layer we have only touched on so far, the layer Paul Ekman spent his career mapping in extraordinary detail, the specific facial signals that separate a genuine reaction from a rehearsed one. In the next video, we are breaking down the exact micro-expression Ekman identified as the clearest single sign of concealed guilt, the one most people get completely backwards. If you want to actually learn to read people instead of just guessing, subscribe now. This was only the first file.